Hey folks, Rick here. Before we get started on this experiment video, let me just remind you to hit that subscribe button, ring that notification bell to get notification of future content as it's released. What is an experiment? So an egg, E-G-G, experiment, is kind of things that we have heard, seen, read about over the past 3 years that we have been raising chickens. We've read a lot of things, we've heard a lot of things from people. We've done our own independent research, not just going out onto blogs, Facebook, or YouTube to figure out how to do things. But to actually read the research. And why I do that will make more sense in a second when we kind of go through a little bit of my background. So we've been raising layer hens exclusively for about 3 years. Each fall we would get our replacement hens for the upcoming winter. We would order them by mail order. They would come from a hatchery. And we've kind of expanded our flock to our maximum, which we hit this year, about 130 birds. We hit that in January of 2020. So when we got last year's, the 2020 or the 2019 replacement birds, we got 5 roosters, accidental hens I'm calling them. So that got me thinking about, well, what could I do with these roosters? Could I begin hatching out my own eggs? So as I said, we started with 5. Right now we're down to 1, Doofus. And Doofus has been in some other videos that we've done. But what I did is I got thinking, how can I use our hens and our rooster to begin hatching out my own eggs versus buying them in the fall of each year? So I took our accidental hen, our rooster, Doofus, began researching the process for hatching out our chicks without buying them. So let's talk a little bit. I'm going to tell you a little bit about my background. So while LaLa and I and the rest of the family, we do operate this little farm, LaLa Farm, it doesn't pay the bills. So we've all got our day jobs, our regular employment off the farm. So LaLa and I are self-employed in a non-agricultural related small business. So educationally, I am trained as a research scientist at the University of Florida. So research not only is a hobby of mine, it is professionally what I do to earn a living. I do that in the private sector in the rehabilitation community. So applying research that I read, that I identify, to real world situations is kind of like my thing. I do that 40 hours a week. So naturally, when I'm asking questions, I kind of already know an answer. I'm just testing hypotheses, and that's really what these series of experiments or experiments will be, is taking a question, applying the scientific method to that question, and then coming up with results and conclusions. Most of the resources that I identified in learning about hatching out eggs were not from Facebook, were not from YouTube. They were mostly from university-oriented agricultural extension offices. So just a few of them. Texas Agricultural Extension Office through Texas A&M University was one of them. So what I learned from Texas A&M was storage time, and I'm just going to quote these. Ideally, eggs should be set in the incubator as soon after gathering as possible to maintain the egg quality. With respect to temperature and humidity, fertile eggs should be stored at a temperature between 55 and 65 degrees. And they said that after 10 days, that hatchability of that egg begins to decline. The University Extension Office for the University of Maine, storage time, kind of still sticking with that 10-day time frame in terms of when it's best to optimize the egg for greatest hatchability rate. With respect to temperature, they said that after collecting, store the eggs in cartons 50 to 60 degrees with a relative humidity of 75%. So that's fairly high. I mean, so it's basically you're storing things outside, because most houses that are air conditioning don't have that high of a relative humidity. So that was another variable that's kind of introduced into this. I also looked at the University of Missouri Extension Office. It's important to cool hatching eggs at a temperature between 45 and 50 degrees as soon as possible after they're laid. Humidity should be around 70 to 75 degrees. So when we look at the different extension offices that I researched, a few things came to mind. Number one is the time element. How old are those eggs? Two is the temperature at which those eggs are stored. And three, the relative humidity of those eggs that they're stored in. So from this research, one thing just really didn't make a whole lot of sense to me. So if you just think about it in your mind's eye, how a hen in a coop would hatch out her eggs. So she's going to lay the eggs. She's going to lay a clutch of eggs, 10 to 15 eggs, and then when she's ready to begin sitting on those, she's going to begin sitting on those eggs to hatch. So she's going to become broody. She's going to sit on those hens until those eggs hatch out as little chicks. So let's say, for example, in Florida, the relative humidity will very rarely ever get, this time of the season at least, down into the 70 to 75% range. And with respect to temperature, we're past the point of ever getting down to 50 to 60, 75 degrees until we get back into fall. So the parameters that the research is saying the eggs need to be subject to in terms of having an egg that's going to be ultimately hatchable don't meet those criteria, particularly in a Florida environment, for at least half the year. So armed with this science from the extension offices, I then reached out to some of the forums that I belong to on Facebook and asked the simple question: how do you store your eggs and still maintain a relatively good hatch rate? So the responses from folks that are reportedly actually hatching out chicks seem to just muddy the water even further than the questions that I already had from reviewing some of the Agricultural University Extension Office research. So I'll just read some of these to you. So you take the eggs as they're laid, then at the same time put them in the incubator. Just make sure the temperature is not too high. I've collected and let them sit in cartons for a few days, point side down so they adjust the air pocket at the top. I had eggs that hatched that were just over 10 days. I collect them, I just leave them in a carton on my dining room table till I get however many I want, then I put them into the incubator. I just let them sit on the table in the house till I have however many I'm wanting, then I put them in the incubator. And this one here is the one that really kind of got me thinking about how much divergence there is with respect to how people are incubating these eggs or storing the eggs. So I incubate 41 eggs every 3 weeks, only have a handful of hens. If I'm within a week of hatching, I'll leave them on the counter. If I'm 3 weeks out, I will put them in the fridge and then pull them out 2 days before they go into the incubator so they slowly warm up. So down into the refrigerator, they're getting down into the 40s. The disparity between what I was finding from the research and what I was getting from these from the field in terms of people that are actually hatching out eggs, that disparity between the research and homesteaders and small farms that are doing this kind of on a hobby basis is kind of what gave me the basis or the idea of doing what we're calling this experiment series. What we're basically doing is an experiment to examine hatch rate, the number of eggs that we ultimately hatch, by age of the egg and the temperature at which each individual egg was stored. So in scientific terms, the dependent variable is the hatch rate, what we're actually measuring, and then the independent variables, those variables that go into that are actually manipulated inside of the experiment are the age of the egg and the storage temperature of the egg. So here's what we have. I have 8 groups of eggs. So each day we had, we would go out and we would collect the eggs just out of the coop that had our 5 Easter eggers in there and Doofus the rooster. So we waited 48 hours after we put these birds together in the coop to begin collecting the eggs for this experiment. We would collect generally 3 to 5 eggs per day. I would pick the 2 eggs that seemed to be the most symmetrical out of that group of eggs each day. I would take one of those eggs that I selected and I would date them and I would put them into the refrigerator. I would take the other one, date it, and put it into a carton on the counter. So the temperature of the eggs on the counter were maintained at 72 degrees over the duration of the storage period. The eggs that were in the refrigerator were held at 46 degrees, which is the temperature that we have our refrigerator set at. So from those two, we then divided, or from those 2 sets of eggs, one in the refrigerator and one on the counter, we then divided them into 4 weeks. So what we've got here are 5 eggs from each group of eggs. Altogether there's 8 groups. So let me show you the 8 groups that we have. So we have 2 groups in each one of these cartons. Each egg has both a date. So for example, this egg was pulled from the hen on May 31st, and then there's a number on it. This is group number 1. This here, group number 1 are the refrigerated eggs from week 1. Group number 2 is the unrefrigerated eggs from week 1. Group number 3 are the refrigerated eggs from week 2. Group number 4 are the non-refrigerated eggs from week 2. Group 5 are the refrigerated eggs from week 3. Group 6 are the non-refrigerated eggs from week 3. Group 7 are the refrigerated eggs from week 4. And group 8 are the unrefrigerated eggs from week 4. So each group has 20 refrigerated eggs, groups 1, 3, 5, and 7, and 20 unrefrigerated eggs, groups 2, 4, 6, and 8. All of those are going to go into the incubator at the same time. As I said, we're measuring the hatch rate by temperature of storage and the age of the egg. So recall that the dependent variable is the outcome measure, the hatch rate. The 2 independent variables, one is temperature or storage temperature, and the second is the age of the egg. So there's multiple conditions that could influence these eggs other than those 2 variables. Those are what's called control variables. So we're trying to make all of the eggs as homogeneous, meaning similar, as we can, so that we can kind of rule out some other features. So some of those controls are kind of the demographics of the population of the actual chickens that were involved in this experiment. So 2 of the hens were 2 years old and 3 of the hens were 11 months old. So they're randomized in terms of the age of the hen because there was no process for selecting an egg from an older versus a younger hen. The rooster involved in this was 11 months old. So each day, I said we collected between 3 and 5 eggs depending on what was laid on that given day. All of the eggs on the outside on the counter were stored at 72 degrees. All of them were maintained at 46 degrees for the duration of the storage time, the ones that were in the refrigerator. Each day I turned the egg. Every one of these eggs got turned for the entire month. So the ones on the counter as well as the ones that were in the refrigerator were turned 180 degrees 1 time a day. So we've used 2 different thermometers to calibrate the temperature of this incubator over a period of about 48 hours. So we've used a digital thermometer inside of the incubator, and we've used an analog thermometer also on the inside, and then converted from Fahrenheit or some Celsius to Fahrenheit. So what we figured out is that the incubator is actually about 3.5 degrees Fahrenheit off of the what it's supposed to be measuring. So I'm glad we calibrated. That way we know that the temperature inside is going to be maintained around 99.5 degrees. So in addition to the temperature, the other control variable is the relative humidity. So we have on the incubator itself, there's a humidity sensor inside. I have a secondary humidity sensor, and we're running an average of about 45% humidity, at least for the first 18 days. So this is off by a little bit. So this one's reading 43%. The actual incubator is reading about 49%. So there's about a 5% difference between the 2 sensors. So we're right around 45 to 50 in that range. So we're using the humidikit from Incubator Warehouse to maintain the humidity level in the incubator using distilled water. So the conditions for the next 18 days should be held at roughly 99.5 degrees with a relative humidity between 45 and 50%. At 18 days, we will open up the incubator. We will take out the automatic egg turner that's inside. We will boost up the relative humidity to around 55 to 60% for the last 3 days of the hatch. And then essentially the outcome measure is going to be the hatch rate for each of the 8 groups of chicks to determine which conditions influenced hatch rate, which had no influence at all, and which had the worst hatch rate out of all 8 groups of eggs. So let's go ahead and get these eggs installed, and then there's not going to be too much to watch for 18 days, but we'll get some additional footage as we're taking them, when we're taking them out, sticking them in for the last 3 days of the incubation period, and then hopefully we'll be able to have some good data to determine what are the ideal conditions given the parameters that we're measuring. So one of the questions I'm sure that I will get with respect to these is, did you sanitize those eggs before you put them in? And the answer to that is no. I don't want sanitized eggs because I want to, basically the question was, how do I make these as relatively similar to what you would get from a hen in nature? I don't want them to be sanitized. I want to know what I'm getting. If I were to just take an egg out, what are the ideal hatch temps? You know, that was one of the things that, you know, in doing the research, that I realized that that'll be another good experiment, because some of the folks that hatch eggs say no, it's not necessary to sanitize the eggs. Just take them out, stick them in an egg carton, and wait and put them until you got enough. Then put them into your incubator. So they don't do any sanitization of the eggs at all, where others swear by it. In fact, I saw some YouTube videos that said not only do they swear by it, but it actually increases their hatch rate. So that'll be another interesting experiment that we can run to determine, you know, does sanitizing the eggs make a difference? You know, another one would be, you know, relative humidity. Some of the folks that are hatching out eggs are saying, you know, I don't pay attention at all to the humidity when I'm hatching the eggs. So they're just basically using the humidity that's present in the ambient air for their incubation period. So that would be another thing that we could test, is using one that has optimal humidity and one that does not have optimal humidity, but it's just using the ambient humidity in the air as the main source of humidity for these eggs. So there we go. There's 40 eggs in there, 8 groups, 20 refrigerated, 20 unrefrigerated, separated into 4 date ranges for when they were hatched. All of these are from some of our Easter egger hens. That's why they're all that really pretty green, various shades of green. So I'm going to close it up now and kind of leave them alone for the next 18 days, I'm sorry, and then come back and then put them into the lockdown and see where we go from there. Hey folks, it's day 18. We are going to take all of the eggs that have been incubating for the past 18 days out of the incubator, remove the rollers, increase the humidity up to 60% relative humidity, and put them into what's called the lockdown period. The lockdown period is the last 3 days of the incubation process. During that period of time, we expect the eggs to begin hatching. Hopefully we will have the results of our experiment by this upcoming Wednesday and Thursday. The 21st day will be this upcoming Thursday. So let's get to this. So I'm going to remove the humidifier. Do this as quickly as we can. All of these are all numbered by group. So when these begin hatching out, all we got to do is look at which one of the eggs have hatched. And we know which ones had the optimal, hopefully we'll be able to determine which ones had the optimal hatch rate. Alright, so let's go through the data now that we have concluded our egg experiment looking at hatchability by age and temperature of the egg. So if you look at this chart right here, it kind of lays out what the egg distribution was in this experiment. So altogether we had 40 eggs. Those 40 eggs were then distributed into 2 experimental conditions. One was refrigerated at 46 degrees. One was unrefrigerated, sitting on the countertop at 72 degrees. Each one of those 2 groups of eggs were further subdivided into 4 groups each based on the age of the egg. So 1 to 7 days, 8 to 14 days, 15 to 21 days, and 22 to 28 days. So my hypothesis coming into this experiment, what I expected to happen was that I would have the best hatch rates with these 2 groups right here, because obviously they would be the newest eggs. When we look back at the research, this is coming from the University of Maine Extension Office, is that hatching eggs should be incubated within a week to 10 days after they are laid. In fact, their research reported that hatchability declines rapidly when incubation is postponed for longer than 10 days. So really what I was expecting to see is these two, since these are the newest eggs, and for the most part even these two, provided they would not be too negatively impacted by the temperature. So these four, particularly these two, would be the best hatch rates out of all 40. Recall that some of the research was saying that if they're going to be stored for longer than 10 days, then they should be refrigerated at between 45 and 55 degrees as soon as possible after they're laid. In fact, every one of the studies, the Extension Office studies, this one was from the University of Missouri, but the University of Maine said the same thing, do not refrigerate them. The rationale being is that refrigerators are set far too low for the hatch rates to be reasonably good. That essentially their research is saying that the hatch rates would be very poor if they were refrigerated in a refrigerator. So that's kind of what we expected to happen. Let's actually show you what actually happened. Same chart. Now these are the actual eggs that were hatched, the numbers of eggs. So in this first condition here, the newest eggs, the one between 1 and 7 days old, we had 0 eggs hatch out of that group. Don't know why. I've got some ideas. We're going to go over that in a second after we get through this chart. The second group between 8 and 14 days, only 1 out of 10 eggs hatched out of this age group, and the one that hatched, interestingly, was the one that was refrigerated at 46 degrees, doing exactly what the Extension Officer said don't do, is the one that hatched out of this group. Let's go down to the ones that I expected really to do the least well, to do poorly in this experiment, the older eggs, 15 to 21 days and 22 to 28 days. Of these, 3 of 10 eggs hatched, or 30% total for that age group, and of those, 2 of those were the refrigerated eggs. When we go down to the 22 to 28, we had 1 egg hatch out of each one of these groups, both the unrefrigerated and refrigerated. So out of the 20 eggs in the refrigerated condition, we had 4 eggs hatch, only about a 20% hatch rate. Out of the 20 eggs that were unrefrigerated, we only had 2, or about a 10% hatch rate. Overall, only 6 eggs hatched for a 15% hatch rate. So by any measure, these are horrible hatch rates. And I really struggled to explain why, because all of the control conditions were really maintained over the course of the 21-day incubation period. And really if I had to kind of give a reason as to what the hatch rate, low hatch rate was attributable to, I would say that it's probably attributable to the incubator that we actually used. And I'll go over that in a bit. So when we look at some of the findings, okay, the main goal of the experiment was inconclusive. What we were trying to do, recall, very early was to determine what condition, by the age of the egg and the temperature of the egg, would be optimal for the highest hatch rate. Well, what we ended up showing was that the ones that should have hatched out with the highest hatch rates actually had the lowest hatch rates. I don't believe that that is a relevant finding. I think that there was something in our methodology that impacted the results of this experiment. Okay. However, even though the main goal of the experiment was inconclusive, there were some secondary findings that I think are important to keep in mind. So that the groups with the newest eggs had the lowest hatch rate. I've talked about that for a second already. Those are the ones that I expected. Those were the freshest. Those were the ones that I expected to have the highest hatch rates, and for some reason we just did not get that. Groups with the oldest eggs meaning the eggs that were 15 to 21 days and 22 to 28 days had the highest hatch rates. So, I've read on some of the Facebook forums that, you can keep eggs for 30 days. Some say you can't keep eggs for 30 days, individual folks that have hatched eggs. And clearly this experiment shows that there's readily viable eggs at 30 days, whether or not it is refrigerated or unrefrigerated. So for one reason or another, those were the highest rates. So I don't know that I'd go any more than 30 days, but our oldest eggs had higher hatch rates than the newest eggs. But out of all of the groups with the oldest refrigerated eggs, that being groups 15 to 21 days and 22 to 28 days in the refrigerated condition, did best. What I believe has to do with the low hatch rates that we experienced in this experiment, I would probably attribute to the incubator. Now, if you recall, when we set this experiment up, we were going to use a HOMESTEAD incubator, which are very well recognized. As I was doing the calibration on the heating element unit and the thermostat unit for our HOMESTEAD, I found out that the thermostat on that unit had failed. So my options were to use our secondary incubator, or we would have to wait for parts for our HOMESTEAD, which would have taken about a week. So we ended up using our secondary one that is not my preferred unit for a number of reasons that I'm going to talk about in a second. We ended up getting the HOMESTEAD part about 2 days after we started this experiment. So, for methodological reasons or purposes, I could not interrupt and then put everything into the HOMESTEAD. So what we have is using a kind of a generic incubator that I just not really impressed with. The incubator that we used has the egg turning system, and that is what I would call a worm wheel cog type of system. So the entire bar that the eggs sit on turns. Well, what that does is, it sounds like that works. It actually does turn the egg, but what it actually does is it turns the egg, and then all of the eggs are driven along this rail system, and they end up kind of bunching up at one end, which keeps them from turning. My belief is that egg turning system in our incubator unit that was used in this experiment probably contributed to poor outcomes. Of the 34 eggs that did not hatch in this experiment, I ended up checking those eggs after we stopped the experiment, and we had another 6 that had partially developed or mostly developed chicks that did not hatch for one reason or another. So that would have doubled our outcome, but for some reason those chicks never started peeping out of the shell. The rest of them did not appear to be fertile, which is a bigger problem, which means that for one reason or another, either the hen was not fertile. I mean, obviously, the fact that we got 6 eggs is telling us that our rooster doofus did his job, but I can't say that he did the job with all of the hens. Because obviously some of the eggs that we introduced into this experiment did not begin to develop for one reason or another. The incubator that we used also was uninsulated and unsealed. It's simply a plastic case, and there is no real seal. It's just plastic on plastic. So that has an impact on the regulation of the heat, and it has an impact on the regulation of the humidity inside of that unit. That may also have contributed to the low hatch rates. We also because this unit did not have the option of even having an external humidifier, we ended up modifying that unit to introduce our humidifier, our external humidifier, to that unit. That may have impacted this as well, because the placement of where that humidifier was plugged into the unit may have contributed. I don't know. So our plan ultimately is to repeat this experiment using the HOMESTEAD, the HOMESTEAD incubator, which is what we had originally planned to use for this experiment. It has been repaired. It's working like a champ. Problem is, I don't have fertilized eggs again. So what we're going to do for this next one is we're going to repeat the same experiment, same protocol, but we're going to use a completely different breed of bird for this next second round experiment, using a white brisset. We have those birds already in our grow out pen right now. I'll probably just keep them in there for the next few months until they begin laying, and then wait about a month or so, and then begin collecting those eggs for incubation purposes. So it's going to take a few months to get this experiment set back up, but that is the plan. And like I said, we're going to be using a different incubator than we used in this experiment, going back to our primary incubator, the HOMESTEAD. So even though we didn't get the results that we actually wanted, I think the results were, we didn't get the results, I guess, that we expected. Not that we wanted. That's not how experimentation works. We did not get the results that we expected, but I don't know that it was related to our protocol. It may very well have been attributed to the equipment that we were using. But in any case, we did have some secondary findings that, in my opinion, kind of bunks the myth that you can't put your eggs into the refrigerator. In our experience, we had perfectly viable eggs from the experiment. In fact, we had the highest hatch rates of all were older eggs that were maintained in the refrigerator. Hey folks, I hope you have enjoyed this hatch rate video. If you haven't subscribed to the channel, please consider doing so. Helps us out a bunch. Make sure to ring that notification bell for future content. And on behalf of one of our little Easter egg chicks, be well. Thank you for visiting the farm. And always remember, treat others as you would like to be treated. Isn't she beautiful? Be well.